This is the story of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, a man who wore the crown but never quite fit inside it. His life teaches us this truth: leadership without God's anointing quickly crumbles. Once upon a time, far before the weight of the crown ever touched his head, Ishbosheth was simply a boy, living in the shadow of giants. He had grown up in the stone halls of Gibeah, running barefoot down corridors while his father trained for war and his older brothers prepared for battle. Saul was tall, broad-shouldered, and fierce, a man who could rally armies with a single shout. Jonathan, his oldest brother, was everything a prince should be: brave, skilled, loyal, loved by the people. And Ishbosheth, he was quiet. He preferred the libraries to the battlefields, the soft gardens to the hard training grounds. He memorized the laws of Moses while his brothers polished swords. When visitors came to the palace, they barely noticed him standing behind the columns, watching. He had heard whispers from the servants even then, not like his father. Too gentle for war. Not built for the throne. He never complained. He loved his family. But even as a child he felt it, that quiet ache of being the one no one expected much from. He remembered standing at the palace gates one evening, watching Jonathan return from battle, riding high on his horse. The soldiers cheered, the people waved, and Ishbosheth, younger and smaller, had simply watched with a strange mixture of pride and distance. "Did you see Ishbosheth?" Jonathan had called, dismounting with a wide grin. "We pushed the Philistines back today." "I saw," Ishbosheth answered, forcing a smile. "You are brave, brother." Jonathan clapped his shoulder, strong and warm. "And you are wise, little brother. We each have our part." But inside, Ishbosheth had wondered, what is my part? Now, years later, that question still haunted him. Only now it hung beneath a royal crown. The sun was rising over a quiet field. A single almond tree stood at its center, blossoms trembling in the morning breeze. And beneath it, Ishbosheth sat alone, staring at the ground. The sound of hooves approached, but he didn't turn. Abner's voice broke the silence. "You've been out here since dawn, my lord." "I needed the quiet," Ishbosheth said softly. "It helps me think." Abner dismounted and walked beside him. "You think too much. You're king now." Ishbosheth smiled faintly, still not looking up. "I was a boy in the shadows once, Abner. Now I wear my father's crown. But I'm not sure the shadows have left." Abner placed a hand on his shoulder. "The people don't need another Saul. They need peace. They need someone who won't lose himself in anger." "They need strength," Ishbosheth whispered. "They need you." Finally, Ishbosheth stood and looked across the open field. "My father fought giants. My brothers led armies. And me? I sit beneath almond trees and wonder if God truly chose me." "You carry the blood of Saul," Abner said firmly. "That is enough for Israel." Ishbosheth nodded, but in his heart he wasn't so sure. The wind shifted. Far beyond the hills where another young king named David tended his growing kingdom, the real battle for Israel's future was already stirring. But for now, Ishbosheth's reign had begun. The days that followed moved quickly, like leaves caught in wind. Ishbosheth sat on the throne of Israel now, a throne once held by Saul, built on victories, stained by mistakes. The royal court at Mahanaim was smaller than Gibeah had been, quieter, less certain. Yet every morning, Ishbosheth, dressed in royal robes, wore his father's signet and tried to carry himself like a king. But inside, he often felt like a visitor in someone else's life. On this morning, he stood by the wide windows of the palace hall, watching servants sweep the stone floors below. In the distance, the river Jordan shimmered under the rising sun. Abner entered, heavy boots echoing on the stone. "Your Highness," Abner began, "the northern tribes are holding, but there's talk from the south again." Ishbosheth didn't turn. "David." "Yes." Abner's voice tightened. "Judah remains loyal to him. He's growing stronger." Ishbosheth closed his eyes briefly. "Was it always meant to be his kingdom, Abner? Even when my father ruled, was David always God's choice?" Abner stepped forward, lowering his voice. "David is ambitious, but he is not the son of Saul. You are. That's not the same as being anointed." Silence grew thick between them. Then Ishbosheth whispered, "Do you ever wonder if we are fighting God himself?" Abner's face hardened. "We fight for Israel, for order. If we do not stand firm, the nation will fracture into pieces." Ishbosheth sighed deeply. "And yet, I don't feel firm inside." That night, sleep didn't come easily. Ishbosheth paced his chamber, troubled by thoughts too heavy to silence. He had seen glimpses of his father's rise and fall. He had heard Samuel's voice once as a boy when the old prophet had visited Gibeah. He still remembered the sadness in Samuel's eyes that day, a sadness Ishbosheth never fully understood. As the moon drifted high, he finally sat by the small lamp at his bedside and whispered a prayer into the darkness. "God of my fathers, if you see me, give me wisdom. If I am only here because men placed me here, show me what you would have me do." The flame flickered gently, but gave no answer. The next morning, a new visitor arrived. A courier, nervous, young, sweating from travel. "My lord," he said, kneeling, "I bring news from across the river." "Speak." "There's been a conflict near Gibeon. One of Abner's small patrols clashed with Joab's men." Ishbosheth straightened. "David's men?" "Yes, my lord." The young courier hesitated before adding, 12 men from each side entered a contest to avoid full battle, but it turned into bloodshed. The field ran red. Abner's forces survived, but Joab's brother, Asahel, was killed." Ishbosheth's stomach tightened. "This will not end well." The courier lowered his head. "The people are uneasy. Some fear this will turn into full war." Ishbosheth rose from his seat. "Abner will come." And sure enough, by nightfall, Abner returned, dusty, angry, but alive. "My king," Abner said as he entered uninvited, "the house of David tests us." "You killed Joab's brother," Ishbosheth said quietly. "He chased me," Abner barked, "like a wild dog, fast and foolish." "Blood calls for blood," Ishbosheth whispered, more to himself than to Abner. Abner stepped closer. "Do not be soft, Ishbosheth. Joab serves a rival king. We are at war, even if no banners have been raised." "But I did not ask for war, Abner. I was hoping for peace." Abner's voice dropped to a growl. "Peace does not keep thrones, my lord. Strength does." And in the quiet space between them, Ishbosheth felt the invisible weight press down again. Not just the crown, but the question that would never leave him. Was I ever truly called to wear this? Outside the palace, the wind stirred through the trees of Mahanaim, carrying whispers of a future neither man yet fully understood. But heaven was still moving, and Ishbosheth's path was only beginning. It had been almost 2 years. 2 years since Saul and Jonathan fell on Mount Gilboa. 2 years since David was crowned king in Hebron, and Ishbosheth, timid, unsure, was lifted to the throne by Abner's hand in Mahanaim. 2 years of uneasy rule. And now, the cracks were showing. Some days, Ishbosheth felt more like a guest in his own palace than a king. He was surrounded by men who saluted with respect but spoke with doubt behind closed doors. And Abner, though loyal, seemed to tower over him more with each passing day. One morning, Ishbosheth stood by the window as usual, watching a small boy chase a goat through the palace yard. The boy laughed, free and unbothered. He envied that. The door behind him creaked open. Abner entered without asking. "My lord," he said, wiping dust from his hands, "the tribes are growing restless. The longer David holds Judah, the more they wonder why they are not united." "Because we are still here," Ishbosheth said quietly. Abner frowned. "Because you are Saul's son. And that means nothing if God has not chosen me." Abner's jaw clenched. "You speak like a prophet," he muttered, "but Israel needs a king, not a poet." Ishbosheth turned slowly. "And what does Israel's general need?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Abner didn't answer. Later that night, Ishbosheth sat in his chamber, troubled again. The words of the prophets, the weight of his father's legacy, and the growing strength of David pressed down on him like stones in a sack. He paced, prayed, then finally questioned. "God," he whispered, staring into the shadows, "do you ever crown someone just to watch them fall?" He felt foolish for even asking, but the doubt had taken root. In the weeks that followed, strange things began to happen. There were rumors, whispers, about Abner, that he had taken one of Saul's former concubines into his house, that he was beginning to act more like a kingmaker than a king's servant. Ishbosheth said nothing at first. He didn't want to believe it. But then one afternoon, as he passed through the hall, he overheard 2 guards murmuring, "Riza, the concubine. Abner has her now. He's testing the king. Everyone knows." That was enough. Later that day, Ishbosheth summoned Abner to his private chamber. "You've taken my father's concubine," he said, eyes locked on Abner's. Abner stiffened. "Her name is Rizpah, and I have done nothing unclean. She belonged to the former king. You know what that implies." Abner stepped forward, voice rising. "You dare accuse me? After I raised you up, I made you king when no one else would. Without me, you would still be hiding in Gibeah, trembling in the dust." Ishbosheth stood his ground, though his heart raced. "You were wrong to take her. It dishonors my father's house." For a moment, silence. Then Abner stepped back, his eyes hard. "That's how little you think of me," he said coldly. "Very well, Ishbosheth. I will leave, and I will take the kingdom with me." The door slammed as he exited. Ishbosheth stood frozen. He had not meant to start a war, but with one question he had. And the one man who held his fragile throne together had just walked out. Outside, the wind blew harder through Mahanaim, like something invisible had shifted. And deep in the south, in Hebron, a king named David would soon hear a knock on his door. Days passed, and Abner did not return. The halls of Mahanaim grew strangely quiet, like the whole city was holding its breath. Ishbosheth still wore the crown. He still sat on the throne. But without Abner beside him, the weight of leadership grew heavier with every breath. Messengers came and went, but none brought comfort. One morning, Ishbosheth sat at the long cedar table in the war room. Maps were rolled out before him, lines drawn, cities circled. But his eyes were unfocused, his thoughts scattered. Marcus, his steward, approached cautiously. "My lord, shall I call the elders for counsel?" Ishbosheth shook his head. "What would they say? That I should have bowed to Abner instead of challenged him? That I should have closed my eyes like every other king who lets men do whatever they please?" He stood suddenly and swept the scrolls off the table. "I didn't ask to be king," he muttered, "but now that I am, I will not rule in fear." Marcus said nothing. He only gathered the scattered maps and stepped back. That night, while Ishbosheth tried to rest, a rider galloped through the city gates. He brought news from the south. Abner had gone to David. Worse, he had promised to bring all of Israel with him: the northern tribes, the military loyalties, the land, everything. Ishbosheth sat in stunned silence. He said, "What?" he asked again. The rider's voice was low. "He met with David in Hebron, made peace with him, promised to shift the throne. He's abandoned you, my lord." Ishbosheth didn't speak, didn't shout, didn't even tremble. He simply stood, walked to the edge of the chamber, and looked out at the hills beyond the city walls. "I built nothing of my own," he whispered, "and now the man who built my kingdom is tearing it apart." A soft voice behind him broke the silence. "You're still wearing the crown," Marcus said gently. "For how long?" Ishbosheth asked. Marcus stepped closer. "Maybe this is not the end. Maybe God is doing something we can't see." Ishbosheth looked up toward the stars. "Or maybe God was never with me at all." But the words hurt as they left his mouth. He didn't know if they were true. All he knew was this: he had tried to lead with honor, but honor without anointing could not hold a kingdom together. And somewhere far away, in the quiet hills of Judah, David waited, patient, steady, anointed. The wind shifted, and the crown on Ishbosheth's head felt colder than ever. Mahanaim had never been so quiet. Not in battle, not in peace, not even in mourning after the deaths at Gilboa, but now the silence felt different, heavy, watchful, as if the city itself was waiting to see which way the winds of power would turn. Ishbosheth walked the halls alone. The sandals of his advisors no longer echoed beside him. His generals held meetings without him now. He still wore the crown, but fewer and fewer people bowed when he entered a room. And deep down, he knew why. Abner had been the spine of his kingdom, and with the spine gone, the body was beginning to sag. One evening, Marcus brought word with a lowered voice. "Abner is dead." Ishbosheth looked up sharply. "What?" "Killed in Hebron. Joab murdered him, stabbed him at the gate, in revenge for Asahel." Ishbosheth stood in stunned silence. He should have felt relief, or even triumph, but all he felt was emptiness. "He was my enemy," he whispered. "No," Marcus said carefully. He was your ally until he wasn't. Ishbosheth turned toward the window, his voice barely audible. And now he's nothing. That night, sleep didn't come. Ishbosheth stared at the flickering lamplight, his mind spinning. He imagined David receiving the news in Hebron, calm, wise, grieving with dignity. Perhaps David hadn't ordered the death, but his camp would benefit all the same. No more Abner. No more protection. No more shield. The next few days brought strange behavior from his captains, quiet murmurs in corners, decisions made without his word. Even the palace guards seemed less alert, their bows not as low. And then came the worst blow of all. A report from the northern border. 2 of Ishbosheth's own commanders, Baanah and Rechab, sons of Rimmon, had disappeared from post. Desertion, it seemed. Ishbosheth read the report, his hand shaking slightly. They were close, he said aloud, ate at my table, laughed with me. Marcus's face darkened. There are men who wear loyalty like a borrowed robe, quick to take it off when it no longer fits their ambition. That night, for the first time, Ishbosheth removed his crown before sleeping. He set it gently on a small table and whispered, "If I am no longer king, let me at least be a man who stood for what was right." But even as he prayed, the footsteps of betrayal were already climbing the stairs outside his room. 2 men, 2 knives, and the sound of fate drawing near. The palace was hushed beneath a pale sky. Not stormy, not violent, just still, too still. Ishbosheth rose early that morning, long before the sun, drawn from his sleep by something he couldn't name. He dressed himself, slowly, deliberately, without the help of servants. He laced his sandals, adjusted his robe, and stared at his reflection in the polished bronze mirror. The face that looked back at him wasn't fierce, it wasn't kingly, but it was steady. He picked up his crown, then paused, and set it back down again. The crown didn't feel right anymore. It felt heavy, cold, like a stone pretending to be gold. He turned to the window instead, opened the shutters, and breathed the early air. A thin fog curled across the courtyard, softening the edges of the world. He didn't know why, but he whispered, "Today feels final." Far below, in the shadows of the outer halls, Baanah and Rechab moved quietly. They had known this palace for years, served in the king's army, shared meals with his household. Their faces weren't suspicious. Their voices weren't sharp. That made them more dangerous than enemies. They moved like ghosts. "Through the servant wing," Baanah murmured. "No guards near his chamber," Rechab replied. "He's more alone than he knows." Back upstairs, Ishbosheth moved through the hallway, trailing his fingers along the wall as he walked. The memories here were everywhere. His father's voice echoing down the corridor, Jonathan's laughter after a hunting trip, the sound of royal banners flapping on Coronation Day, the silence that came after. He reached the old armory. The door was slightly ajar. Inside were relics of Saul's rule, shields that hadn't seen battle in years, helmets too dented to wear. He stepped inside, ran his hand along the hilt of a dusty sword. He didn't lift it. Instead, he sat on the old bench by the wall and waited. He didn't know what he was waiting for. A word from heaven? A sudden change? Or just the end? Down the hall, Baanah and Rechab crept closer, blades hidden beneath their cloaks. No one questioned them. They were familiar, trusted, until today. "I'll strike first," Baanah whispered. "No," Rechab said. "We both strike." Ishbosheth heard the footsteps before he saw them. He turned slowly as the two men entered his chamber. Their smiles were thin, forced. "My king," Rechab said, bowing slightly. Ishbosheth looked at them with tired eyes. "Is that what I still am?" he asked quietly. Neither man answered. He nodded. "I see." He did not shout. He did not run. He did not fight. Instead, he stood and spoke the only thing left in his heart. "If you think removing me will make you kings, then you do not understand what makes a man great." They didn't hesitate. 2 blades, a quiet gasp, and then silence. When they left, they took his head in a sack, riding for Hebron to present it as a gift to David. They thought they would be praised. They thought they would be rewarded. But what they didn't know, what they never imagined, was that the man they betrayed had died with his dignity intact, and that the man they were riding toward was nothing like Saul. Back in Mahanaim, the fog lifted slowly over the palace, and the room where Ishbosheth fell remained quiet. No crown, no throne, just the echo of a man who never asked for power and never lost his honor. It was a hot afternoon in Hebron when the horses arrived. Dust clung to the messengers' robes. Flies buzzed around their sweating foreheads, but they rode like men carrying a treasure, like heroes returning from a conquest. Their prize? A blood-soaked sack. Rechab and Baanah approached David's palace gate with crooked smiles and puffed chests. When the guards stepped forward, they held up the sack like an offering. "Let us speak to King David," Rechab said. "We bring good news." They were led into the hall without delay. David sat beneath a simple cedar roof. He wore no crown, only a plain tunic, and his face was calm as they entered. His commanders stood nearby, Joab among them, arms crossed and watching closely. Rechab bowed low. "My lord," he said, "we've come from Mahanaim." "From the house of Saul." David gave a slight nod. "And what news do you bring?" Baanah stepped forward and untied the sack. The head of Ishbosheth fell to the ground with a dull thud. Gasps filled the room. David did not move. Baanah mistook his silence for approval. "We struck him down in his sleep," he said proudly. "The son of your enemy is dead. The throne is clear. All Israel is yours." Still, David said nothing. Then slowly he stood, and his voice was like a sword wrapped in sorrow. "You murdered a man in his own house," he said. "A righteous man, lying in his bed." Rechab's smile faded. "But, my lord, he was your rival, Saul's son." David stepped forward. "He was not my rival. He was my brother." Silence. "Ishbosheth never attacked me. He never chased me through the wilderness. He sat on the throne his father left behind, not by greed, but by fear. And now you bring his death to me as a reward?" Rechab opened his mouth, but no words came. David turned to his guards. "Seize them." The guards didn't hesitate. Rechab and Baanah were pulled backward, stunned. "But we did it for you," they cried. "No," David said quietly. "You did it for yourselves." And just like that, the blood they spilled became their own sentence. That night, David mourned. Not because Ishbosheth had been powerful, not because he had lost a rival, but because a man who had tried to lead with dignity, without violence, without anointing, but with trembling integrity, had been destroyed by men who mistook murder for loyalty. He walked the length of his chambers, remembering Saul, remembering Jonathan, and now, the last son of that broken house. "Weep for Ishbosheth," David said to his court, "for his life was fragile, and his death was unjust." And from that day forward, the throne of Israel was united under David. But it did not come from war, it came from tears, because David knew something Ishbosheth had always feared. The real crown does not come from men, it comes from God. The next morning, the sun broke across Hebron like it always did, gold and soft and gentle. But in David's heart, a storm still lingered. He sat in silence at the edge of the palace garden, head bowed, hands clasped. A single almond blossom had fallen onto the table beside him. It reminded him of something or someone. "Ishbosheth," he whispered. The name still carried weight. Not the weight of envy, not the weight of battle, just the quiet ache of a shared history. Behind him, Nathan the prophet approached slowly. "The kingdom is united now," Nathan said. "The people are ready to follow you." David nodded. "But they follow with wounded hearts." "You could bury Ishbosheth in secret," Nathan said. "He was not your ally." David looked up. He was Saul's son, Jonathan's brother, a prince of Israel. We don't erase people just because they weren't strong. Nathan was quiet. "I want his body returned from Mahanaim," David said, "with honor. Let him be buried near the tombs of his family." "And the men who murdered him?" "They've already received their reward," David said firmly. "Let Israel learn that we do not build this house on betrayal." Later that week, word spread quickly through the towns and hill villages. "David mourns for Ishbosheth. The king buries his fallen brother with honor. The kingdom will be built with justice, not revenge." Even in Mahanaim, where Ishbosheth's name had begun to vanish from lips, there were those who paused in the streets, who remembered his quiet rule and wept quietly at the news. And in Hebron, a slow peace began to rise. At the burial, David stood among the elders of both Judah and Israel. A large stone marked the place with a simple inscription beneath it: "Ishbosheth, son of Saul, leader in the valley, quiet in heart." As the crowd stepped away, David lingered. He spoke softly. "You never asked for the crown, but you wore it. You tried. And that matters more than people know." He bent down and placed the almond blossom on the stone. And in that moment, the story of Ishbosheth, the boy in the shadow, the reluctant king, the man who tried to lead without force, was no longer just a forgotten name. It became a lesson. That leadership without God's anointing may not last, but character leaves a trail even after the crown is gone. The kingdom of Israel began to heal. Not overnight, not without scars, but it healed. The elders of the tribes gathered in Hebron and pledged their loyalty to David, not out of fear, but out of unity. There was a sense, whispered in village homes and spoken in campfires, that a new day had begun. A king with courage had replaced a house of fear, but there were still those who remembered the in-between, who remembered Ishbosheth. In Mahanaim, a servant named Eliab still lit a small oil lamp in the old prayer room, just like the king had done each night, not out of ritual, but out of memory. He prayed here, Eliab told a young boy who had begun tending the outer gardens, every night, even when no one believed in him. The boy wrinkled his nose. "But he wasn't a great king, was he?" "No," Eliab said gently. but he was a good man, and sometimes that's rarer. Farther north, in the tribe of Issachar, a shepherd named Hamuel gathered the youth of his village and told them stories of the kings, of Saul, of David, and yes, even of Ishbosheth. One day, he said, you might be given something you didn't ask for, a role, a burden, a place of influence, and you might feel unworthy. But if you carry it with humility, even for a short season, God sees it. Ishbosheth, he added, was not anointed like David, but he honored what he had. He didn't raise his hand in pride. He didn't thirst for battle. He carried what others gave him until the end. And somewhere, in a small village near the Jordan, Rizpah, the former concubine Abner once claimed, sat quietly by a well with her 2 sons. She remembered Ishbosheth not as a ruler, but as the only man in Saul's house who ever spoke to her with kindness. She whispered his name like a blessing. Ishbosheth, a soft man in a hard world. Though his reign had been brief and brittle, his memory lingered, not in shouts, but in stories. Not in scrolls, but in lives he quietly touched. And David, in his wisdom, allowed those stories to be told. He never removed Ishbosheth's name from the royal lineage, never mocked his failure, never boasted over his fall. Because David knew that thrones come and go, but humility leaves a trail even where crowns cannot. And Ishbosheth's trail, though faint, was still glowing in the hearts of those who had walked beside him. The palace in Jerusalem was still new, stone courtyards, echoing halls, and the scent of cedar from freshly cut wood filled the air. David walked through it all slowly, listening to the sound of builders hammering in the distance and the light laugh of his young son Solomon chasing after a rolling olive pit. The nation was growing strong again, unified under one name, one throne, one king. But David, wise as he was, knew strength alone would not hold it together. One evening, he sat with Solomon in the shade of a fig tree. The boy was young, curious, always full of questions. "Abba," Solomon asked, "was there ever a time when you weren't king?" David smiled. "Oh yes, for many years." "Was Grandpa Saul the king then?" "He was," David said softly. "And after him?" David hesitated for a moment. Then instead of talking about battles or betrayals, he told the boy a different story. "There was a man named Ishbosheth," David began. "He wore the crown for a short time. He was Saul's last son." Solomon's eyes widened. "Was he brave like you?" David chuckled quietly. "He was brave in a different way. He didn't fight with swords. He didn't shout to be heard. He ruled in silence, carrying a crown that didn't quite fit his heart." "Was he a bad king?" "No," David said. "He was a burdened king, a man who tried to do right, even when he didn't know how. He listened. He prayed. He never took revenge. And when he was betrayed, he died with more dignity than some men live with their whole lives." Solomon looked at his father thoughtfully. "What happened to him?" "He was killed by men who thought power was more important than honor." "And you punished them?" "I did." Solomon was quiet, then asked, "Why are you telling me this story?" David looked out toward the hills of Judah, where the sun had begun to lower in a haze of gold and lavender. "Because one day you might be king," he said. "And when that day comes, I don't want you to only remember the strong ones, the warriors. I want you to remember the quiet ones too, the ones who didn't win, but didn't lose themselves." He placed a hand on Solomon's shoulder. "Remember Ishbosheth. From that day on, Solomon often asked for the story again. And when he became king, some say he had a chamber in his house filled with scrolls, not just of law and wisdom, but of names. One of them was Ishbosheth, a name tucked quietly between the bold and the bloody. Because in Solomon's heart, that name meant something. It meant, don't wear a crown if you won't carry it with humility. And it meant, even a forgotten king can teach the next one how to lead. Years passed. Solomon grew into wisdom. The palace in Jerusalem gleamed like gold in the sun. The temple was built. Israel became the strongest it had ever been. But Ishbosheth's name? It was almost never spoken anymore. Almost. Somewhere near the northern hills, in a small village where traders passed and shepherds grazed their flocks, an old woman taught her grandson to pray. "Why do you always pray so softly?" the boy asked one night, fidgeting with the edge of his cloak. "Because sometimes," she said, smiling, "the strongest prayers are the ones not shouted." The boy looked confused. She patted his hand. "There was once a king who ruled like that, quietly. He didn't win great wars. He didn't build temples, but he tried to lead with a good heart." "What was his name?" Ishbosheth. The boy had never heard it before, but he remembered it. Years later, when he served as a scribe in Jerusalem, he would whisper that name whenever pride tried to climb into his chest. In another village far to the east, a traveling Levite visited a small community to teach scripture. After a long reading about King David, someone asked from the crowd, "What happened to Saul's family after David became king?" The Levite paused, and then told the story of the last son. "He ruled for only 2 years. Some say he was too weak, but I believe he was simply too human, and God saw him, just like he sees us when we are doing our best, even when our best isn't enough." The people listened, and one farmer in the back, who had long believed his small life had no value, walked home that night with hope in his heart. Even in Jerusalem, beneath the temple's highest wall, an old priest recited names as part of an ancient lineage: Saul, Jonathan, Mephibosheth. And then, quietly, he whispered, "Ishbosheth." No one noticed, but heaven did. Because Ishbosheth's name had not been buried with his body. It had been planted. And from it, unseen fruit continued to grow. In the kindness of a leader who chose gentleness over power. In the prayers of a servant who ruled nothing but still carried dignity. In the wisdom of a king who taught his sons to listen for the quiet ones. And in every broken-hearted person who needed to hear, "You don't have to be famous to be faithful." Ishbosheth's kingdom had crumbled, but his story? His story was still breathing. It would have been easy to forget him. No songs were written for Ishbosheth, no monuments raised, no feast days declared in his name. There was no trumpet blast at his death, no scrolls written about his victories. Only a short line in the royal records. And Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, reigned over Israel for 2 years. But the heavens remember differently. Because God does not count only victories, he counts faithfulness. And Ishbosheth, for all his doubt and weakness, tried. He stood in a place he did not ask for. He wore the crown with trembling hands. He never killed for power. He never built a monument to himself. He never waged a war against David. He could have, but he didn't. And in choosing to honor what little was in his control, he honored the one who was in control of everything. In the quiet of heaven's scrolls, Ishbosheth's name isn't marked as failure. but as faith in a difficult season. One scribe, years later, would write in the margins of his manuscript, "He was not the king Israel needed, but he was the brother who kept the peace until the right one came." That peace mattered because it gave Israel time to mourn Saul, time to let go of bitterness, time to see that David was not just another ambitious warrior, but a shepherd of the heart. And that time, however fragile, was given by the one who held the kingdom quietly between his fingers and then let it go. In this way, Ishbosheth became part of the healing. Not by force, not by brilliance, but by standing in the space between what was and what would be. Some stories are not written in bold ink. Some are drawn in pencil, shaded lightly, easily smudged by history, but not by God. Because every faithful life becomes part of His larger story, even the ones no one remembers, even the ones that crumble. Many years had passed. David was old now. His hands trembled when he held a harp. His eyes watered in the morning sun. The crown that once felt light now rested heavy on his aging brow. He had seen glory. He had seen grief. And in the quiet hours before sunrise, he often remembered names the world had long since forgotten. One morning, as the breeze slipped through the palace windows, David sat beside a young servant boy, Mephibosheth's son. He watched the boy draw shapes in the dust with a stick, his tongue poking out in concentration. "Your father was kind," David said. The boy looked up. "You knew him?" "I did," David nodded. "And I knew his uncle, too." "Ishbosheth?" David smiled faintly. "Yes, Ishbosheth." The boy tilted his head. "Was he a strong king?" David looked toward the olive grove outside. "No," he said honestly. "But he was a faithful one, and sometimes that's even harder." He paused, then spoke more to himself than to the boy. "He didn't try to kill me. He didn't chase power. He didn't last long, but he stood in the middle of a war and didn't let the kingdom fall apart." The boy listened closely. David sighed. He made room for what God was doing, even if it meant his own story would be small. That evening, David called for his royal scribe. "There's a name I want included in the royal annals," he said, "not just as a date, not just as a placeholder." "Whose name, my lord?" "Ishbosheth, son of Saul." The scribe hesitated. "He ruled during the divide." David nodded. "Yes, but he didn't divide the people. He held the line until I could step into it. Write that." And the scribe wrote. That one sentence sealed Ishbosheth's legacy not in shame, but in purpose. He was not the king who built Israel. He was the king who held the space for it to become whole. He made room. In his quiet, unsure, trembling way, he made room for David, for peace, for the promise of God to unfold. And even though his crown was short-lived and his death was quiet, his purpose was part of something eternal. Ishbosheth's name never made it into the songs. No one carved his victories into stone. No psalms were written in his honor. No crowds cheered when he entered a city. Even the crown he wore never really felt like it belonged to him. And yet, his story still matters. Because Ishbosheth shows us something the loudest kings never could. That not every calling looks glorious, that not every throne is built by ambition, and that a life of quiet faithfulness still echoes in eternity. He didn't slay giants like David. He didn't command prophets like Saul. He didn't build altars or defeat armies or leave behind a long dynasty. But Ishbosheth did something just as rare. He stood in the gap between two kings and didn't destroy either one. He could have made himself an enemy of David, could have gone to war with God's anointed, but he didn't. When his own general betrayed him, Ishbosheth didn't lash out. When people doubted him, he didn't kill for respect. And when men came to his room in the darkness, blades hidden beneath cloaks, he didn't run or beg. He stood, not as a warrior, not as a prophet, but as a man with dignity. And that was enough for God to remember him. Some people spend their lives chasing crowns. Ishbosheth held one he never asked for and gave it up when the time came. Not with rage, not with rebellion, but with grace. And here's the twist. The people who tried to erase him, Rechab, Baanah, even Abner, are mostly forgotten. But Ishbosheth, he was buried with honor, mourned by David, respected by the people, and remembered by heaven, because in God's kingdom, greatness isn't just measured in victories. It's measured in obedience, in restraint, in choosing peace over pride. That's what made Ishbosheth special. He was ordinary, but he was faithful. He never claimed to be a hero. He never crowned himself, but he carried what he was given, and when it was time to let go, he did. We all have moments like Ishbosheth, moments when we feel overshadowed, unseen, like the story isn't ours to lead. But Ishbosheth teaches us, you don't need to be the loudest to be the most faithful. You don't need to hold the crown forever to honor it well. And when your part in the story is done, God still sees you. So if you've ever felt forgotten, small, not enough, remember the quiet king whose name still whispers through the pages of Scripture. Not because he was mighty, but because he was true. And in the end, that's the kind of king heaven honors most.